October always had a strange energy to it, like the world teetering on the edge of something forgotten and ancient. That year, it was no different. The leaves had turned brittle, hanging onto the branches like they were afraid to fall. The days were getting shorter, the nights longer and darker than I could ever remember. And the wind was full of whispers. It all started when I moved back to my childhood home in New England after my parents passed away. The house had been empty for years, a two-story Victorian relic standing just outside a small town in the middle of nowhere. My brother Jake and I had grown up there, but after he left for college and I followed soon after, the place sat neglected. Now it was up to me to either sell it or make it livable again. Jake didn't want any part of it. He was living in California, far removed from the cold northeastern nights. "Too many bad memories there," he said when I called to tell him I was moving back. "But if you're up for it, knock yourself out." Bad memories. Yeah, that was one way of putting it. The town was small, but it had its share of dark stories. Haunted woods, strange deaths, unexplained disappearances. Our parents, too, hadn't been without their secrets. But I never really believed in the local legends. Not until this Halloween. The first night back, the house felt colder than it should have, as if the walls had soaked up years of neglect and were now radiating it back. I turned the heat on, threw some sheets over the furniture, and cracked open a beer. It was strange being back, with the creaks of the old place so familiar but still unsettling. I should have felt comforted by the familiarity, but there was something about the stillness of the house that felt off. I blamed it on being alone in such a large place after so many years. The wind outside howled through the trees that lined the property, the tall oaks swaying like ancient sentinels. It sounded like voices, soft at first, but growing louder as the night wore on. It was around midnight when I first heard the knock. It wasn't the polite knock of a visitor or the forceful bang of someone in distress. It was a hesitant, almost unsure tapping, as if someone or something wasn't quite sure it wanted to be let in. 3 taps. Then silence. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the front door. My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone on the road when I drove up earlier. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and I couldn't imagine anyone walking up the long, overgrown driveway in the middle of the night. I waited. Another knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. I don't know why, but every instinct I had told me not to open the door. But of course I did. There was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, the wind biting at my skin. The night was impossibly dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I strained to see anything beyond the edge of the porch light's glow, but the driveway was empty. The woods beyond it a solid mass of shadows. Shivering, I turned back inside, locking the door behind me. I must have imagined it, I told myself. It was the wind, or maybe a tree branch scraping against the house. But as I stood there trying to shake off the lingering unease, I heard something else. A soft, whispering sound, almost like someone muttering just beneath the range of my hearing. It came from the woods. Over the next few days, I busied myself with cleaning up the house, sorting through old boxes, and making plans to fix up the place. There was a part of me that wanted to sell it and leave, but another part felt tethered to the house like it held something important that I couldn't walk away from. The whispers continued every night, sometimes louder, sometimes so faint I wasn't sure if I was hearing them at all. But they were always there, just outside the house, as if the wind itself was trying to tell me something. One evening, as I was going through some old family photos in the attic, I came across a dusty journal buried in a box of my father's things. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn. I didn't remember my father ever being the type to keep a journal, but as I opened it, I realized it wasn't his. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tight, angular letters that looked hurried, frantic. The first entry was dated October 24th, 1963. The voices are getting louder. I can't escape them. They follow me into the woods, into the house, into my dreams. They want something. They want me. Chills ran down my spine as I read. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last. Whoever had written the journal had become obsessed with the woods, convinced that there was something out there, something ancient and malevolent that was watching, waiting. October 31st. I saw it. I saw it in the trees. I can't stay here anymore. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't go into the woods. The journal ended abruptly after that. No signature, no explanation. I stared at the final page, the words burned into my brain. I should have felt ridiculous, reading some old paranoid scribblings. But there was a part of me, a deep, primal part, that believed every word. That night the knocking came again. But this time it wasn't at the front door. It came from the window. Halloween arrived, and with it, an uneasy tension settled over the town. I went into town for supplies that morning, and the few people I spoke to seemed on edge, their eyes darting nervously toward the thick woods that bordered the town. I hadn't told anyone about the journal or the strange knocks at night. What could I say? That I was hearing voices in the wind and being haunted by something I couldn't explain? As I walked through the small grocery store, an old man at the counter caught my eye. He was thin, with a shock of white hair and a face lined with age. He watched me for a moment before nodding in my direction. "You staying out at the old Bennett place?" he asked, his voice raspy. I nodded, surprised that he knew. "Be careful up there," he said. "Halloween's a bad night for the woods." I frowned, waiting for him to elaborate, but he just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning away. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in town knew something I didn't, that they were all keeping a secret, and then I realized no one had ever said anything about my parents after they passed. No condolences, no mention of them at all. It was like they had been forgotten or erased. That night, as I sat in the living room, the whispers were louder than ever. They seemed to surround the house, pressing in from every direction. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then just after midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the whispers rose, swelling into a cacophony of voices that filled the air. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. And when I finally managed to switch it on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the woods, just beyond the porch, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the beam of the flashlight. I froze, my heart racing, as the figure slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the house. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and in that moment, I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to come outside, to follow them into the woods. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure didn't move, just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, standing in the middle of the living room with the flashlight shaking in my hand. But eventually the whispers faded, and when I dared to look outside again, the figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The next morning I called Jake. I didn't tell him everything, just that I was feeling uneasy in the house, that strange things had been happening. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "I didn't want to tell you this," he said, his voice hesitant. "But Mom and Dad, they weren't the first ones to live in that house. Before we were born, there was another family, the Bennetts. They disappeared one Halloween. The whole family. No one ever found out what happened to them." My stomach dropped. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Didn't you ever tell?" "Because I didn't think it mattered. We lived there for years without anything happening. I thought it was just one of those old town legends, you know. But if weird things are happening now, maybe you should leave." I wanted to tell him about the journal, about the whispers, but I didn't. It sounded insane, and I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. And this time, they weren't just outside. They were inside the house. I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing the hallway outside my bedroom. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder than ever, surrounding me, pressing in on me from every direction. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, getting closer. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my door, There was a long, agonizing silence, then a soft knock, 3 taps, the same as before. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The door creaked open. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the same one I had seen outside the night before, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. But now I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and backing away as the figure stepped into the room. It didn't move like a person. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The whispers grew louder, deafening, and I realized they were coming from the figure. It was the source of the voices. It was the thing that had been haunting me, calling me. "Leave," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "Get out." The figure stopped, tilting its head as if it was considering my words. Then slowly, it turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was haunting the place, whatever was out there in the woods, I wanted no part of it. I packed a bag, threw it in the car, and drove into town. As I pulled into the gas station, I saw the old man from the grocery store standing outside, smoking a cigarette. He watched me as I got out of the car, his eyes narrowing. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think it's for the best." He nodded, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Smart move. That house, it's got a way of keeping people who don't belong there." I frowned, unsure of what he meant, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As I got back in the car and started the engine, the old man called after me. "Whatever you do, don't go back." Not on Halloween. That's when they come. I never went back to the house. I sold it a few months later, and I've never looked back. But every year as Halloween approaches, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there in those woods, waiting. Sometimes late at night, I hear the whispers again, and I wonder how long I can stay away. I never believed in ghosts, curses, or haunted towns. Growing up, Halloween was just another holiday for me. A night of candy and costumes, scary movies, and the occasional haunted house attraction that never really scared me. So, when I heard about the legend of Hallow's End, it didn't shake me. I wasn't interested in ghost stories, but something about the way people talked about that town made me curious. It was as though Hallow's End had been forgotten on purpose, its memory buried beneath 100 years of silence. The story went that Hallow's End was a small town that thrived in the late 1800s, nestled deep in the woods of western Massachusetts. No one had lived there for decades, not since the town's sudden and mysterious abandonment one Halloween night in 1903. As the legend went, the townspeople simply vanished. No signs of a struggle, no bodies ever found, just empty streets and untouched homes, as if the entire town had been plucked off the map overnight. It was the kind of story you heard around a campfire, the kind you laughed off but couldn't entirely shake once the flames died down and you were left alone with your thoughts. It was said that if you visited Hallow's End on Halloween, you'd vanish too, just like the people before. Some said the town was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of the people who had once lived there, forever trapped in a place between life and death. I'm not sure what possessed me to go looking for it. Maybe it was the challenge of proving to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. Or maybe it was because, deep down, part of me wanted to believe in something greater than the mundane routine of everyday life. Either way, I convinced my 2 closest friends, Jenna and Chris, to come with me. It was the weekend before Halloween, and we were restless. The kind of restless you only feel when you're young, when you think nothing bad could ever really happen to you. We piled into Chris's Jeep and made the 3-hour drive from Boston to the dense woods of western Massachusetts. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, mostly because we didn't want to deal with the mockery and disbelief. Plus, we weren't planning on staying long, just long enough to satisfy our curiosity and maybe take a few pictures for a good story later. But by the time we reached the edge of the forest that led to Hallow's End, I was starting to have second thoughts. The road leading into the woods was narrow and unpaved, winding like a snake through towering trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The deeper we drove, the more the light faded, as if the forest itself was swallowing it up. Chris kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "Don't tell me you're actually scared," Jenna teased from the passenger seat, but I could hear the nervousness in her voice. "No," Chris shot back, "but something feels off." I didn't respond. I was too busy looking out the window, watching the trees blur past. There was a strange stillness to the air, a silence that felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed muted, like it was afraid to disturb whatever lay ahead. After what felt like an eternity, we finally saw it. The old wooden sign, barely visible beneath layers of moss and decay, with the words "Hallow's End" carved into the weathered wood. Chris slowed the Jeep to a crawl, and we all leaned forward, staring at the sign in a mix of awe and disbelief. "We made it," Jenna whispered, almost like she didn't want to break the eerie quiet that surrounded us. Chris parked the Jeep at the edge of what used to be the main road into the town. It was overgrown now, the asphalt cracked and crumbling, nature reclaiming what had once been a bustling little community. I grabbed my backpack from the back seat, stuffed with snacks, flashlights, and a first aid kit. Chris had brought a couple of cheap walkie-talkies just in case, and Jenna was armed with her phone, determined to capture everything on camera. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We walked down what remained of the road, our footsteps crunching on the brittle leaves that carpeted the ground. The town appeared slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it didn't want to be found. The first building we came across was an old general store, its windows broken, the door hanging on rusted hinges. Beyond it were a row of houses, their front porches sagging with age, ivy crawling up their sides like long-forgotten veins. "Creepy," Jenna muttered, snapping pictures with her phone. "But cool." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I wasn't a believer in the paranormal, but the air here felt different. Thicker, somehow. Oppressive. Like we were intruding on a place that didn't want us there. "Hey, check this out," Chris called from further down the road. He was standing in front of what looked like an old church, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The double doors were ajar, and through the gap, I could see rows of dusty pews, the altar draped in cobwebs. "Want to go inside?" he asked, grinning. I hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe we should stick to the open areas." "Oh, come on," Jenna scoffed. "It's just a building." She pushed past me and headed inside, Chris following close behind. Reluctantly, I followed them into the church, the air inside thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the sound echoed in the stillness, making it seem louder than it was. "I can't believe this place has just been sitting here all these years," Jenna said, running her hand along one of the pews. Dust clung to her fingers, and she wiped them on her jeans. Chris wandered up to the altar, his flashlight sweeping across the floor. "You think anyone's been here since it was abandoned?" he asked. I shrugged, but before I could answer, Jenna let out a small gasp. "Look at this." She was standing near the back of the church, her flashlight trained on something carved into the wall. We hurried over, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine when I saw what she had found. It was a word, etched deep into the wood, the letters jagged and uneven. It said, "Beware." "Okay, that's unsettling," I muttered. Chris chuckled nervously. "Probably just some prank from a long time ago." "Maybe," Jenna said, though she didn't sound convinced. She took a picture of the carving and turned to leave. "Let's check out the rest of the town." We spent the next hour or so exploring what was left of Hallow's End. There wasn't much, just a handful of dilapidated buildings and the remnants of what used to be a town square, now overgrown with weeds and vines. The whole place felt frozen in time, like it had been abandoned in a hurry and no one had bothered to come back. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the town, the unease I had been feeling all day grew stronger. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. "We should go," I said finally, my voice tense. "We've seen enough." Jenna frowned. "But we haven't even—" "We've seen enough," I repeated more firmly this time. I didn't know how to explain it, but I had this overwhelming sense that we needed to leave. Now. Chris must have sensed it too because he didn't argue. "Yeah, let's get out of here. It's starting to get dark." We made our way back to the Jeep, and I felt a surge of relief when I saw it waiting for us at the edge of the road. But that relief was short-lived. As we climbed into the Jeep, and Chris turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered once, twice, and then went silent. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, trying again. The engine refused to start. "Is this some kind of joke?" Jenna asked, glancing nervously at the darkening woods around us. Chris shook his head, his expression grim. "No joke. I don't know what's wrong with it. It was fine when we drove up here." I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. "Try again." He did, but the engine remained stubbornly dead. "Great," Jenna muttered, crossing her arms. "Now what?" I didn't have an answer. We were miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods, with no cell signal and a Jeep that refused to start. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep shade of purple, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. "Maybe it just needs to rest," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's give it a few minutes." We sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over us. I tried to think of a plan, but all I could focus on was the growing sense of dread that seemed to seep into my bones. Something wasn't right here. Something was wrong. "Do you hear that?" Jenna asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze, straining my ears. At first I didn't hear anything. But then, faint and far away, I caught it. A low rhythmic sound like chanting. "Is that singing?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. It wasn't singing. It was something else. Something older. Something darker. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." Chris tried the engine again, but it still wouldn't start. Panic was rising in my chest, and I could tell from the look on Jenna's face that she felt it too. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We walk," I said, grabbing my backpack. "We can't stay here." Chris hesitated, glancing at the dark woods around us. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "Do you want to wait around and find out what that is?" I snapped, pointing toward the direction of the chanting. It was getting louder, closer. That was all it took. We grabbed what little supplies we had and started walking down the road, the fading light barely enough to guide our way. The trees closed in around us, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out, and the chanting grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. It was guttural, otherworldly, like something out of a nightmare. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the darkness, and the chanting that seemed to surround us. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. The road continued ahead, but it was overgrown with weeds and brush, barely visible in the dim light. We stopped, out of breath and out of options. "We're lost," Jenna said, her voice tight with fear. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. We had no idea where we were, no idea how far we had walked, and the chanting was still there, still following us. Chris slumped against a tree, running a hand through his hair. "We can't keep walking in the dark. We'll just get more lost." "What do you suggest we do?" Jenna asked, her voice rising with panic. "I don't know," Chris snapped. "I didn't sign up for this." "None of us did," I shouted, the fear finally bubbling over. "But we're in it now, so we need to figure out—" I stopped mid-sentence, my blood running cold. The chanting had stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the noise. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. "What is it?" Jenna whispered, her eyes wide. "I don't know," I whispered back, "but I don't think we're alone." And then from the shadows, we saw them. Figures, cloaked in darkness, emerging from the trees. There were dozens of them, maybe more, moving silently through the woods toward us. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their bodies wrapped in tattered robes that blended with the night. But the worst part wasn't the way they looked. It was the way they moved. They didn't walk. They glided like shadows slipping through the air, their feet never touching the ground. Their eyes, those that were visible, glowed with a dim, eerie light, like embers in the dark. For a moment, we were frozen, too terrified to move. But then one of the figures raised a hand, pointing directly at us, and I felt my body go cold. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted, sprinting down the road as fast as we could, the figures moving after us in eerie, silent pursuit. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see how close they were. We ran until my legs burned, until I thought I couldn't go any further. But just when I thought we might lose them, we stumbled into something even worse. The road ended, dropping off into a massive pit that stretched out before us. It was too wide to jump, too deep to climb down, and too dark to see the bottom. "We're trapped," Jenna gasped, her voice trembling. Chris swore under his breath, pacing at the edge of the pit, his eyes darting back toward the figures who were closing in on us. I looked around, desperate for a way out. But there was nothing, just the pit, the trees, and the figures who were slowly but surely surrounding us. "What do we do?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "I don't know." The figures stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching us in eerie silence. Their glowing eyes locked on us, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, one of them stepped forward. It was taller than the others, its robe darker, its hood pulled low over its face. But as it approached, I could see something beneath the hood, something that looked like bone, a skull. The figure reached out a hand and I saw something glinting in its bony fingers. A key. "What is that?" Chris whispered, his voice shaking. The figure raised the key higher as if offering it to us, but I knew better. This wasn't an offer. It was a choice. The figure pointed toward the pit with one skeletal finger, then back to the key. The message was clear. The key was our only way out. But what price would we have to pay to take it? I swallowed hard, my mind racing. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't outrun them. The only option we had was to take the key. But at what cost? I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and reached for the key. As my fingers closed around it, the figure's bony hand tightened around mine, and I felt a surge of cold rush through my body, like ice flooding my veins. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, the key still clutched in my hand. The pit was gone, the figures were gone, and we were back on the road. The sun was rising, casting a pale light through the trees. Chris and Jenna were beside me, stirring as they woke. What happened?" Jenna asked, sitting up and rubbing her head. "I don't know," I said, looking around in confusion. "But we're alive." Chris stood staring down the road. "Look." In the distance I could see it, the sign for Hallow's End. We had made it out. But as we started walking toward the Jeep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something had come back with us. And as I glanced down at the key in my hand, I realized that the nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. It's been a year since we left Hallow's End, and none of us have been the same since. Chris won't talk about what happened, and Jenna refuses to acknowledge it at all. But I can't forget. The key sits on my desk, a constant reminder of that night. I've tried to get rid of it, but it always comes back, no matter where I hide it. And every night, I hear the chanting in my dreams, growing louder, closer. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but I know one thing for certain: Hallow's End isn't done with us. Not yet. I can still remember the cold bite of the October wind that night, the way it rattled the window panes and sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The sky was an ink-black canopy dotted with stars, and the moon hung full and bright, bathing the earth in a pale, eerie glow. It was Halloween, and while most people were out enjoying parties or trick-or-treating with their kids, I was cooped up in my childhood home, waiting for something much darker. My name is Katie, and this story is one I've kept buried for years. It happened when I was 20, at a time in my life when I thought I was invincible, when the lines between the living and the dead felt like nothing more than a joke. But after that night, after we played with the Ouija board, everything changed. I never wanted to tell this story. I never wanted to relive what happened. But as Halloween approaches each year, I find myself thinking back to that night. And the fear, the dread, comes creeping back, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. It was me, my best friend Emily, and her brother Jake. We'd been inseparable since we were kids, always daring each other to do the dumbest, most reckless things. Halloween was no different. Every year we made it a tradition to do something spooky, something to test our courage. But in 2012 we decided to go all out. Emily had found the Ouija board while we were rummaging through the attic of her house a few weeks earlier. It was one of those old battered ones, the kind that looked like it had been around for decades, maybe longer. I remember the way the faded letters on the board seemed to shimmer in the dusty light, and the planchette, an old wooden one, not the cheap plastic kind you find in stores, had a strange, weighty feel to it. It wasn't like the cheap Hasbro versions you could buy at the mall. This one felt real. "Let's do it on Halloween," Emily had said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "It's the perfect night for it." I'd laughed it off at the time. We'd done so many ridiculous things together that I didn't even think twice about it. A Ouija board? It seemed harmless, silly even. But as the night drew closer, something in me began to shift. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like a sense of foreboding, like something deep inside was telling me to stay away, to let it go. I wish I had listened. Halloween night arrived and we gathered at my house. My parents were out of town for the weekend, which made it the perfect place for our little seance. The house was old, a creaky two-story colonial that had been in my family for generations, the perfect setting for a night like this. I remember sitting in the living room, staring at the Ouija board as Emily and Jake set it up on the coffee table. The lights were off, and the room was lit only by a few flickering candles. The shadows danced along the walls, giving the room an otherworldly feel. "You ready for this?" Emily asked, her voice full of excitement as she plopped down next to me on the floor. "Yeah, sure," I said, though my stomach was churning. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing inside me all day. Jake, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes as he sat on the other side of the table. "This is going to be such a waste of time," he muttered. "There's no way this thing actually works." "Then what's the harm?" Emily shot back, grinning at him. "If it's all fake, then you've got nothing to worry about, right?" Jake just shrugged, but I could tell he was getting antsy. He never liked to admit it, but deep down I think he was just as creeped out as I was. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, the smooth wood cool against my skin. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath. Emily's voice broke the silence. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak with us?" Nothing happened. We sat there, fingers resting on the planchette. The only sound, the faint creaking of the house as it settled in the cold night air. I exhaled slowly, relieved that nothing was happening, that this was all just a silly game. But then the planchette moved. It was slight at first, just a twitch, like someone had accidentally nudged it. I glanced at Emily, but she looked just as surprised as I was. Jake raised an eyebrow, but kept his fingers on the planchette. "Who are we speaking to?" Emily asked, her voice softer now, more cautious. The planchette slid slowly, deliberately, across the board. I felt my heart rate pick up as it stopped on the letter M. Then it moved again. A. M. A. "K," Jake said under his breath as the planchette continued to move. "Mark," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. My throat tightened. I didn't know anyone named Mark, but something about the name sent a chill down my spine. "Are you a spirit?" Jake asked, his tone a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The planchette slid to yes. I pulled my hand away from the planchette, feeling suddenly cold. I didn't want to play anymore. This wasn't fun. It was unnerving, like something was lurking just beyond the edges of the room, watching us, waiting. "We should stop," I said, my voice barely steady. "Oh, come on," Emily said, though her bravado had dimmed. "It's just getting started." I wanted to argue, to tell her that we needed to end this now, but before I could say anything, the planchette jerked violently across the board, the sharp scraping sound filling the room. It spelled out, "DONTLEAVE. Don't leave." "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his eyes wide now, his bravado completely gone. "We're done," I said, standing up, my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't..." The candles flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder, darker. I could feel the air change, like something had stepped into the room with us. Suddenly, the planchette moved on its own, without any of us touching it. It slid across the board rapidly, spelling out a new message, STAY. "Did you see that?" Emily's voice trembled now, her earlier excitement replaced with fear. I nodded, my mouth dry. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near that board. But before we could do anything, the lights flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The candles snuffed out at the same moment, leaving us in pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window. I heard Emily gasp, then Jake curse under his breath. "Everyone stay calm," I whispered, my voice shaking. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to turn on the flashlight. But no matter how many times I pressed the button, it wouldn't turn on. None of our phones worked. The darkness was oppressive, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The temperature had dropped so sharply, it felt like I was standing outside in the dead of winter. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, barely audible, like someone muttering just beneath the range of hearing. It was coming from the corner of the room. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice unsteady. No one answered. The whispering grew louder, but still too quiet to make out any words. It sent chills down my spine, the kind that made me feel like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice rising in panic. Just as I spoke, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. And then the sound came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the walls and vibrating in my chest. "Oh my God," Emily whimpered. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Then, without warning, the planchette flew off the table, hitting the wall with a loud thud. The growling stopped, replaced by a high-pitched, distorted laugh, a sound that didn't belong in this world, something so unnatural it made my skin crawl. "Run!" Jake yelled, snapping me out of my paralysis. We bolted from the room, stumbling through the darkness, our footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors. I could barely see where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from whatever was in that room. We made it to the front door, yanking it open and bursting out into the cold night air. The wind howled around us, and I could feel my heart racing, my chest heaving with each panicked breath. But just as we thought we were safe, we heard it again. The laugh. It was coming from inside the house. We stood on the porch, gasping for breath, staring back at the front door like something was about to burst through it. The laugh had stopped, but the air was still thick with tension, the kind that made my skin prickle and my instincts scream to run. "What the hell just happened?" Jake asked, his voice shaky as he bent over, trying to catch his breath. Emily didn't answer. She was staring at the house, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I followed her gaze, half expecting to see a figure standing in one of the windows, watching us. But there was nothing. Just the dark, silent house looming over us like a shadow. I don't know, I stammered. But I don't think we should go back inside. We can't just leave everything in there, Emily said, her voice trembling. My phone, the board, everything. I don't care about the board, Jake snapped. That thing is cursed. We need to burn it. I nodded in agreement. Whatever we did, we've unleashed something. We can't let it stay here. Emily looked hesitant, but after a moment she nodded too. Okay, she whispered. Let's get it over with. Taking a deep breath, I led the way back into the house. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a warning. The house didn't want us here anymore. Something had taken control of it, something that wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. We stepped back into the living room, the candles still extinguished, the room shrouded in darkness. The Ouija board lay on the coffee table, the planchette now back in its place, as though it had never flown off the table. How? Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the sooner we destroyed that board, the better. Grab it, Jake said, his voice low. Let's take it outside and burn it. I nodded, moving toward the table with slow, deliberate steps. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to turn around and run, but I couldn't. I had to finish what we started. I reached out to grab the board, but just as my fingers brushed against the worn wood, the room seemed to shift. The air grew even colder, the shadows stretching and twisting like something was moving within them. And then I felt it. Something was watching us. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness and the flickering candlelight. I don't like this, I muttered under my breath. I don't like this at all. Jake stepped forward, his expression grim. Just grab the board, Katie. Let's end this. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and lifted the board from the table. It was heavier than it should have been, like it was filled with something dark and malevolent. Without another word, we hurried back outside, the wind biting at our skin as we stepped onto the porch. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had followed us from the house. Jake, get the lighter, I said, my voice trembling. Jake fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a small lighter he always carried with him. His hands were shaking as he flicked it on, the flame casting a faint glow over his face. We burn it, he said, his voice steadying. We burn it, and this ends. I nodded, placing the board on the ground in front of us. The wind howled around us, but I forced myself to focus. We needed to finish this. Jake crouched down, holding the flame to the corner of the board. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood didn't catch, the flame barely licking at the edges of the board. What's wrong? Emily asked, her voice filled with panic. Why isn't it burning? I don't know, Jake muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held the lighter closer, the flame growing larger, but the board refused to ignite. Frustration and fear boiled inside me. Try the planchette, I said, my voice trembling. Jake nodded, shifting the flame to the planchette, but the same thing happened. Nothing. No matter how close he held the flame, the wood wouldn't burn. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling around us in a frenzy, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more menacing, until it filled the air around us. Stop it, Emily screamed, covering her ears. Make it stop. But the laughter continued, a twisted, distorted sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We need to leave, I shouted over the wind. We need to leave now. Jake stood up, his face pale, the lighter slipping from his fingers and falling to the ground. "It won't let us," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It won't let us go." Panic clawed at my chest, and I could feel the presence growing stronger, closing in around us. It wasn't just a spirit. It was something darker, something far more powerful, and it wanted us. The laughter reached a fever pitch, echoing through the trees, as if the very air around us was mocking our fear. I felt my pulse racing in my throat, and I grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the driveway. We had to get away, but the deeper into the night we ran, the more it felt like the darkness itself was coming alive, reaching for us. "We have to get to the car," I shouted, though the wind tore at my words. Jake was right behind us, his face pale and set with determination. I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe we could outrun this thing, but there was no other option now. The car was just ahead, but as we reached it, I felt something shift in the air, as if the atmosphere had grown even denser. The laughter abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence that pressed down on us like a suffocating blanket. "Get in!" Jake shouted, yanking the car door open. Emily scrambled into the back seat while I leaped into the passenger seat, my fingers fumbling with the seatbelt. Jake jammed the keys into the ignition, turning them frantically. The engine sputtered, coughed, but refused to start. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, turning the key again and again. But the car wouldn't start. It was as if the very air around us had turned against us, trapping us in place. I glanced out the window, my breath catching in my throat as I saw them. Figures, shadowy figures standing at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the darkness. They were still, watching us with glowing, inhuman eyes. "What the hell are those?" Emily whispered from the back seat, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared, frozen with fear, as the figures began to move toward us, gliding across the ground like they weren't walking at all. "They're getting closer," Jake said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to—" Suddenly the car roared to life, the engine rumbling beneath us. Jake didn't wait for a second chance. He slammed his foot on the gas and we lurched forward, speeding down the driveway and away from the house. I kept my eyes on the figures, watching as they faded into the distance, but I knew they weren't gone. They were just waiting for the right moment. The ride back to town was a blur. We didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the car, like a storm cloud ready to burst. By the time we reached Emily's house, it was nearly dawn, the first light of the new day casting long shadows across the road. Jake pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. We sat there in silence, none of us wanting to be the first to break it. Finally, Emily spoke. Her voice was soft, shaky. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. "We don't talk about it," Jake said finally, his voice hard and cold. "We forget it ever happened." "Forget it?" I repeated, incredulous. "How are we supposed to forget what just happened? We can't just pretend." "Yes, we can," Jake interrupted, his eyes blazing. "Because if we don't, it'll follow us. It'll never leave us alone." The words sent a chill down my spine. I knew he was right. Whatever we had awakened that night, it wasn't going to let us go easily. It wanted something, and it wasn't finished with us yet. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figures standing at the edge of the yard, watching, waiting. The laughter echoed in my dreams, taunting me, reminding me that it was still out there, somewhere. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not my parents, not my friends at school. It was like we had made a silent pact, me, Emily, and Jake, to never speak of that night again. But the fear lingered, gnawing at me like a slow, festering wound. It wasn't until a few weeks later, just as the nightmares were starting to fade, that I realized the full extent of what we had done. It was a cold, rainy afternoon in November, and I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on my homework. My parents were in the kitchen, talking quietly as they prepared dinner. The soft murmur of their voices was a comfort, a reminder that the world was still normal, still safe. But then I heard it, a soft knock. I froze, my pencil hovering above the page. It was the same knock I had heard on that Halloween night, the same 3 slow, deliberate taps. I turned toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The rain was tapping lightly against the glass, but there was no one outside. No figures, no shadows. Just the empty yard, drenched in the afternoon rain. But I knew it was back. The knocking continued night after night. Always the same. Always at the same time. Just after midnight. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the window or the door. Sometimes so faint I thought I was imagining it. But I wasn't. I never answered the knock. I never even dared to look out the window. I just lay in bed, my heart pounding, the fear wrapping itself around me like a vice. I knew what it was. I knew what it wanted. But I didn't know how to stop it. Emily wasn't faring much better. She stopped coming to class, stopped answering my calls. When I finally went to her house to check on her, her mother told me she wasn't feeling well, that she'd been staying in her room for days, barely eating or sleeping. I could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the way her voice trembled when she spoke. I wanted to talk to Emily, to tell her that I was feeling the same thing, that I knew what was happening to her. But every time I knocked on her bedroom door, there was no answer. Jake, on the other hand, had shut down completely. He wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't even acknowledge it. He pretended like everything was fine, but I could see it in his eyes. The fear was eating him alive, just like it was eating the rest of us. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard the knock again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. This time it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door. I knew I shouldn't answer it. I knew better. But something inside me, some desperate, irrational part of me, told me I needed to. That if I didn't face whatever was out there, it would never stop. I climbed out of bed, my heart racing, and made my way down the stairs. The house was silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. My parents were asleep, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I reached the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat, and then, without thinking, I pulled the door open. There was no one there. The night was cold and still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I stepped out onto the porch, my bare feet sinking into the wet wood. The yard was empty, the street beyond dark and silent, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence, hovering just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. A voice, soft, distorted, barely more than a whisper. Come back. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew I was back in bed, the first light of dawn streaming through the window. The front door was locked and everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. The voice stayed with me. It echoed in my head, day and night, a constant reminder that it was still out there, waiting for me to return, to finish what we had started. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next knock, the next whisper. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the house. It was a few days before Thanksgiving when I finally gathered the courage to return to my childhood home, the place where it had all begun. Emily and Jake had stopped talking to me by then. They wanted to forget, to move on, but I couldn't. I knew that whatever we had unleashed wasn't going to let us go until we faced it, until we finished it. I pulled up to the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The old colonial loomed over me, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a corpse. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me as I stepped out of the car, the chill of the late autumn air biting at my skin. I made my way to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent, but I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had followed us from that Halloween night. It was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold beneath my fingers, sending a jolt of fear through me, but I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I had left it. The living room, the coffee table, the Ouija board, it was all the same. But the air felt different, heavier, darker, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. I walked over to the coffee table, my eyes fixed on the Ouija board. It was still there, untouched since that night, the planchette resting in the center of the board. I sat down in front of it, my heart racing, my hands trembling. I didn't want to do this, but I knew I had no choice. I had to finish what we started. I placed my fingers on the planchette, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Is there anyone here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the house silent. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It slid across the board, the letters forming a word I had been dreading for weeks. Hello. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew what it was. I knew who it was. "Mark," I whispered. "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, faster this time, spelling out a new message. YOU. I pulled my hands away, fear flooding my veins. But the planchette didn't stop. It moved on its own now, spelling out the same message over and over again. YOU. YOU. I stood up, backing away from the table, my heart racing. "I won't do it," I said, my voice shaking. "I won't play your game anymore." The room grew colder, the shadows twisting and writhing like something was moving within them. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and I could feel the presence closing in around me, suffocating me. And then, I heard it again. The voice. "Come back." I turned, my heart racing, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, like he had been dead for years. But I knew who he was. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, like he was dragging himself through the air. "You," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You brought me here." I shook my head, backing away. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice cracking with fear. "It was an accident." The figure stopped, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice cold and empty. "You belong to me now." I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him. But then something inside me snapped. "No," I said, my voice steadying. "I don't belong to you." The figure tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "You can't escape," he rasped. "You opened the door. You let me in." I shook my head, my fear turning to anger. "You don't control me," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I made a mistake, but I'm not yours." The figure stepped forward, his presence looming over me, suffocating me with its darkness. "You will come back," he whispered, his voice cold and empty. But I didn't listen. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the house, far away from the darkness that had consumed it. That was the last time I ever saw Mark, the last time I ever went near that house. I don't know what he was, or where he came from. I don't know if he was a ghost or something darker. All I know is that we opened a door that night, a door that should have stayed closed. And now, every Halloween, I feel him. I feel his presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I won't let him. Not again. Because now, I know how to fight back. And I know how to win. It's Halloween night again, and I'm sitting in my apartment, the lights on, the door locked. I can feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, the darkness creeping closer. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've learned how to protect myself. I've learned how to close the door, how to keep the darkness at bay. But I know one thing for sure. The spirits of Halloween are always watching, always waiting. And if you're not careful, they'll take you too, just like they almost took me.